When designing the user interface, we should be just as intentional as we have been with designing the awesome back end. We have spent 13 weeks discussing and planning in intimate detail what our software is going to do, and we need to be just as intentional with the front end. Much of the time, programmers spend so much time on the back end that the front end just becomes a throwaway or something to put in place in order to capture the necessary information for the back end. So what we've been doing over the last few weeks is being much more intentional about how to design the front end. So what we're going to be talking about next is some standards, some things that we might want to think about as we are putting together the front end. These are things that we want to think about, to plan for, common elements that we can implement across most of the screens on our interface. Now, we recognize that not all screens are going to be exactly the same, but we need to plan how to create a series of common elements. There are 5 different elements that we're going to talk about. And the first one is called a metaphor. The metaphors are real-world concepts that our software will model. And it's important that we're using real-world concepts that our user can relate to. An example of this is when e-commerce first came out. Imagine for just a minute that you have never really done any shopping online, and Amazon comes out and they say, we want you to buy stuff from us. So you're going to take an item and you want to purchase an item, and then you find a second item that you want to use, and then you find a third item that you want to use. What kind of metaphor from the real world could I use to express what I'm going to do with all of those items that I want to buy? And everyone has gone to the grocery store, and you take an item and you put it where? You put it in a shopping cart, and then the second item goes into the shopping cart. And so the idea of a shopping cart is very familiar to everyone. And so when e-commerce sites decided that people wanted to buy things, you put the items in your shopping cart. This is an example of a metaphor. Another one is an example of a Word document. When we first started doing all of our writing online, if you open up a Word document or any text editor for that matter, what is the image that I see on the very first page? It looks remarkably like a piece of paper, because for generations, when we wanted to send somebody some information, we would break out a piece of paper and write it down manually. Word even goes so far to have page breaks, so that if I scroll down a document, I can see literal page breaks between the individual pages, because they are using a metaphor of a piece of paper. Another metaphor that you may or may not be familiar with is in a software program, an accounting program such as Quicken. And when Quicken first came out, people, when they would do their banking, were paying their bills using actual physical paper checks. And so when Quicken and QuickBooks and other sort of accounting software first came out, the idea of paying your bills would, when you clicked on a button to pay a bill, it would open up a graphic that looked exactly like a check. And so there would be a space where you would type in the date, and there would be a space that you would type in the amount, and there would be a memo tab where you could type in who it was going to be going to. And so Quicken was using as a metaphor an actual graphic of a check, a paper check. These are all examples of metaphors, real world concepts that the users can relate to. The second thing to support the metaphors are going to be objects. Our software system is going to be full of objects, and we want to give the objects names that will support the metaphor. We need the objects names to be descriptive, and we need them to support the metaphor. So supporting the metaphor, let's go back to the shopping cart on Amazon. I might name the objects things like DVDs, songs, movies, books, a Kindle book, an ebook. The objects that the system is made up of are going to have names. And if we can name them things that support the metaphor, it becomes more and more familiar to the user. The same kind of objects exist for our Word document. It is actually called a document, and it has pages in it. For our checkbook, the objects that support the metaphor, there are checks, and we pay bills, and there are payees, and all of these objects are defined to support the metaphor. So the next interface standard that we want to take into consideration are the actions. There are going to be a variety of actions that take place within our software, and we want to name the actions things that will be familiar to the user. So think for just a minute some of the actions that can take place in Amazon, in our shopping cart. Do you use the word buy, or would you use the word purchase? Both of these mean exactly the same thing. They have the same meaning. If I were to break out my book of antonyms, I might be able to acquire, obtain, gain. I know some of these don't fit very well, but they're all actions that are taking place, and we need to decide which one of these names that we want to use. I know in our homework assignment we have been managing things, and a part of manage was to add, update, and delete, but I did have some students that were using different words besides add, update, and delete. I'm going to move this screen down to give myself a little bit more room. All right, instead of add, update, and delete, I had some students that wanted to create. Instead of adding, they wanted to create. And instead of update, they wanted to modify. And instead of delete, maybe archive. These are the same words with the same meaning, but different words. And so the third part of the interface standards are to give descriptive names to the actions that will be taking place. The next conversation, or the next thing that you want to think about, are the icons that you're going to be using. What images will you be using? There are a lot of commonly recognized icons. Are you going to use those commonly recognized icons, or are you going to modify and create some custom ones of your own? Let's look at some of the different icons. Here's an example of a Java IDE called NetBeans. The icon that you use in order to run or execute a program is this green triangle area, or arrow at the top. The green arrow will run the program. So let's look at another IDE. What does the icon look like in Visual Studio if you want to run a program? Again, it's the same green triangle symbol that indicates run. It's a classic sort of media button icon that means run or play. We're going to look at another IDE. So this IDE is called JGrasp, and what I've always found fascinating about JGrasp is that if you want to run a program in JGrasp, there is no green play button, no green triangle. Instead, there is this red running man. And if this is the first time you've ever used JGrasp, that might be the icon that you are looking for. So JGrasp has chosen to create a custom icon that most users would not be familiar with. There are a ton of very common icons, such as the save button looks like a floppy disk, and the copy button looks like two pieces of paper, and the cut button looks like a pair of scissors. These are commonly recognized icons regardless of the program that you are using. I can go into a Word document and I can see the same icons. There is a pair of scissors indicating cut. There is a two pieces of paper icon indicating copy. So there are very commonly recognized icons, and then there are some icons that the developer of the software has decided to custom create. So a part of defining the design standards for the interface is to decide what icons that you will be using in the system. The last one, number 5, is template. A template is a way of defining the general appearance of all of the screens or most of the screens within the system. This can apply to forms and output reports as well, and it doesn't have to be an exact template, an exact standard for all of them, but if you have some sort of a general idea of how to create consistency among all of the interface that your user will be using, it creates a sort of familiarity. This includes consistency in the fonts that you want to use, consistency in the color schemes, also the navigation areas. If you're going to have the navigation on the top on one screen and then move it to the bottom on the next screen and then move it to the left on the third screen and then just completely leave it off on the fourth screen, this can make the users unsatisfied with the product. We also have the windows. Should the windows cascade? Should they overwrite? Should they replace? This next one is called order of actions. I am used to a certain specific order that actions take place. And the first time that I used the canvas grader and I had to reverse the order of actions, it was very disconcerting to me. So let me show you what I'm talking about. Here's an example of a Word document, which I'm most familiar with. If I want to do something in a Word document, I select the text first, and then I click on the action that I want to apply. I am familiar with selecting the text first and then executing some kind of an action on it. That is the most common order of operation or order of action. The Canvas grade book actually does that backward. This is what the Canvas speed grader looks like. This is how I grade your assignments in Canvas. But instead of selecting the text and then pressing or selecting the action that I want done, I have to do exactly the opposite. If I want to strike through something, first I have to select the strike through button, and then I come in and select the text that I want to act upon. If I want to highlight, first I select the action, and then I can come in and select the text that I want to act upon. Exactly opposite of everything that I am used to. So that's where the idea of order of action comes in. So these are the 5 components of the interface design standards. Having a conversation or thinking about each one of these individual elements as you are intentionally designing the user interface. It is not an afterthought. We need to be intentional about the design interface or about designing the interface.